Hi, I'm Aaron Wary, in for Jamie. You may have noticed that the Trump administration has been talking about communism lately. A lot. Not as a historical evil, but as a living threat to the United States.
The Bolshevik takeover of the Democrat Party is in full swing.
We have literal self-proclaimed communists who are winning elections and who are claiming to be the new leadership of the Democrat Party.
I think it's the biggest threat to our nation there is, maybe since our founding. That includes World War I, World War II, September 11th. It includes the Pearl Harbor attack.
And these aren't just words. The administration has issued orders like National Security Presidential Memorandum 7, which directs federal agencies to investigate networks it says are funding or facilitating political violence and identifies anti-capitalism as a driving force. Secretary of State Marco Rubio recently convened representatives from more than 60 countries for a summit on what the administration calls the resurgence of far-left political terrorism. And the State Department has published an extraordinary report on alleged Cuban subversion, one which names prominent American left-wing organizations and individuals, including the Democratic Socialists of America, broadcaster Amy Goodman, and streamer Hassan Piker. For some experts, this is reminiscent of a previous era of American history, the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Today we're going to hold this current political moment up against the last one, and ask whether the United States has entered a new Red Scare. Ellen Schrecker is one of the foremost historians of McCarthyism in the United States, and the author of several books on the subject, including Many Are the Crimes, McCarthyism in America. Ellen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson has warned that communism is on our shores.
So look, we live in dangerous times. We're fighting communism on our own shores.
And that, quote,
the barbarians are in the gate.
The Trump administration has created new laws and directives which interpret left-wing activism through the prism of national security and even terrorism.
Last November, the State Department designated 4 violent, far-left extremist groups as foreign terrorist organizations. And there will be more designations soon.
What would you say, given all that, to those who say this has the makings of a new Red Scare?
Well, it does and it doesn't. There are a lot of similarities. I read through that national security memo of number 7 and discovered that Trump wanted to have the Attorney General list all the supposedly subversive organizations in America. And I thought, oh my God, back in the McCarthy era, the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations played a major role. I don't think it's going to happen again that way. I'm often asked, is it going to happen again? And I usually say, yes, but not the same way. And now I usually say, and today it's worse. We'll get into that, I do believe. McCarthyism differs enormously in that there was, quote unquote, communism in existence in the United States. It wasn't a threat. It was a small and very beleaguered political group that came under pressure during the Cold War because it was a useful political tool, just like it is today, for the Republican Party to attack Democrats as soft on communism. There are still Democrats around, but there aren't really any communists, and they're no threat whatsoever.
Right. I was just going to say, because it does seem, this talk of communism does feel like a throwback to the Cold War and something that might not really resonate with, newer generations of Americans. Why do you think this rhetoric still has some appeal to Donald Trump and the American right?
I think because it was there on the shelf. I mean, my gosh, they have an attorney general's list. And then look, there were congressional hearings looking for what? I think they're not going to get all that much clout and mileage out of attacking this little ghost movement that doesn't exist. What they're doing is trying to find a way to eliminate left-wing criticism in the United States.
That's what you essentially feel is the end goal here?
Yes.
Politicians, to state the obvious, say inflammatory things all the time, but this might now go beyond rhetoric. I mentioned NSPM 7 in the intro.
That directs, for the first time in American history, all of our law enforcement and intelligence agencies to work together to disrupt, identify, defund, debank, arrest, and prosecute these political terrorists that are operating in our country.
There was Marco Rubio's political terrorism summit.
For far too long, however, our counterterrorism doctrine has had a blind spot when it comes to extremist violence from the political left. Even today, the very idea that far-left terrorism could be a serious threat is treated as a right-wing fever dream, or worse, as a dangerous fascist conspiracy.
Historically, when does something like this cease to be rhetoric and become something more than that, something more consequential?
When the people with power decide that it has to become a major front in their political work, as it were, in their need to amass power.
Left-wing terrorism always ends in bloodshed, misery, and suffering. It only can travel in one direction. There's no point at which the left-wing terrorist is satisfied with his gains and ceases progressing.
Because communism is the enemy of free people everywhere in the world. Never works. It's the enemy of the Constitution. Above all, it's the enemy of July 4th, 1776.
They need to find a target. What are they? They can't attack millionaires, billionaires. I mean, the people would join them if they did that, but they are doing, they're just accumulating power, and in Trump's case, money for themselves. And how do you get people to go along with them? And, certainly the first or the second Red Scare, the Cold War Red Scare, was quite effective. So maybe they think they can just go back to history. I'm not sure they can.
Following that summit that Marco Rubio hosted, the State Department released a roughly 100-page report describing Cuba as a center of 21st century communist subversion. The document mentions dozens of well-known Americans and organizations. As I said, the Democratic Socialists of America, Black Lives Matter, Amazon Labor Union, Amy Goodman, Hassan Piker, as well as elected politicians, Congresswoman Maxine Waters and Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass. What do you make of that document?
It read like an old document produced in the early 60s by the House Un-American Activities Committee that was trying to whip up anti-communism after the end of McCarthyism. I could have, changed the names of the organizations, but it's that kind of listing of organizations, pulling them out of context, attesting to giving them much more power and influence than they have, and trying to resurrect a subversive boogeyman or scarecrow. And I don't think it's working.
Do Republicans really think that this stuff is going to happen? No, they don't. They're trying to scare people because they don't want us talking about the fact that we all have a right to health care in this country. So they want to call it communist.
The caricature is you're a communist who's going to nationalize the industries. You're going to take over Goldman Sachs.
I'm actually coming on this podcast to let you know that it's now my podcast.
Wait, what?
Yes.
It didn't work, I would say, when Ron DeSantis tried to make it central to his campaign for the presidency back in 2023-24. He just gave up because the American people, I don't think, really are concerned about Cuban espionage in the United States. It's just not very high on people's lists.
We've talked about McCarthyism. We've mentioned it several times here already. This is probably a good spot to sort of go back to that history and explain it, because McCarthyism is probably a term some people have heard without really knowing the history. Can you talk to me about Joseph
Sure.
McCarthy, the Red Scare, and what McCarthyism actually was?
McCarthyism actually was very seriously misnamed. What I consider McCarthyism is what you could accurately call the Cold War Red Scare or the Second Red Scare, but we should call it the Cold War Red Scare because it wouldn't have existed without the Cold War, after all. That had an enemy, right? The Soviet Union, and communism was, in fact, a movement that did have ties in the United States and around the world with the Soviet Union. And I would say it was designed to eliminate all the influence of the individuals, the ideas, and the organizations that had anything to do with the Communist Party in the United States. And there was a Communist Party. It had at its peak maybe 75 to 100,000 members. But it certainly couldn't have mounted a revolution and never tried to and never thought it would.
The question is, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party?
In the federal court in New York, trial begins for 11 of the 12 communist leaders who are charged with a conspiracy to teach and advocate the forcible overthrow of the U.S. government.
Fear of communist subversive activities has developed into hysterical frenzy which grows daily.
Investigating alleged communist influence and infiltration in the moving picture industry.
Philip Jessup, who flew home to testify, bitterly denies charges of Wisconsin Senator McCarthy, who accused him of having an unusual affinity for communist causes.
Alger Hiss, former high state departmental official, is branded a communist spy by an American jury after a sensational trial.
If we wanted to give it a name, however, of an individual, I'd nominate J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, who I think really created not just the notion of a communist enemy and was able to flesh it out with examples and scary moments of, communist sailors on merchant ships, sinking them in the middle of New York Harbor or something.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America, just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government.
Hoover really was, if any one single individual was, the creator of the machinery, the mechanism through which McCarthyism, that Red Scare, operated. And it operated in accordance with a two-stage procedure. The first stage was exposure, identifying the individuals or organizations that were a threat, which is what Rubio's rather detailed presentation, in fact, was doing, exposing the so-called Cuban threat in the United States. The second stage was the imposition of sanctions on these supposedly dangerous, subversive people and organizations. And that was done mainly through economic sanctions. People lost their jobs. We were not yet, let me say, not yet, but it could come, at the stage of, during McCarthyism, too much in the way of criminal prosecutions.
There is no doubt as to where a real communist loyalty rests. Their allegiance is to Russia, not the United States. Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic. And like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
Was it membership in the Communist Party, attending a meeting? Like, how wide a net were they throwing?
They were throwing as wide a net as they could. Often the FBI had programs, one of which they used within to identify teachers and professors. They would go to the president of a college, for example, and slip them a sheet of paper with a list of a professor's affiliations with these supposed front groups. And that would be enough for that professor, especially if he or she didn't have tenure, to just not be renewed the next year. So we actually do not know how many people got fired, lost their jobs, were blacklisted because of these kinds of actions on the part of the FBI. The FBI was also feeding names to congressional committees, to the House Un-American Activities Committee, the sort of grandfather of all the anti-communist McCarthyist groups, to the more sedate, as it were, Senate Internal Security Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, and also, of course, to Joseph McCarthy's committee, until McCarthy himself sort of self-destructed in a way that is, I'm afraid, all too reminiscent of what goes on day to day in the White House. Former FBI agents went into business. They became blacklisters, professional blacklisters. They put out a magazine called Red Channels, or it was a sort of a pamphlet, a booklet, that listed entertainment industry figures and their front groups. And interestingly enough, everybody whose name was in this organization, Red Channels, tended not to be hired within the entertainment industry. But it's that cooperation, that collaboration by the main institutions of civil society that made McCarthyism so powerful. And that's what we have to realize today as well.
On that institutional consensus, the American academic and author Corey Robin has cited estimates that something like 40% of the American workforce was ultimately subject to some form of loyalty or security investigation. How did, what we now call McCarthyism gain such consensus? Was it just that backdrop of the Cold War? What was it that made this so broad?
It was certainly the Cold War. There's no question about that. That you have to think of what the United States was like, and it sort of explains McCarthyism, maybe even in a way today. We had just won World War II. We were all powerful. We had the bomb. Turned out the Russians got the bomb too, through communist espionage. Never forget that. And so there was an anti-communist scenario out there within universities that a communist teacher or communist professor would indoctrinate his or her students with Marxist-Leninism in class. Well, if you've ever taught, if you could ever indoctrinate your students, if you could ever get your students to read their assignments, you were lucky. This was taken very seriously, even though it was not true. And what was interesting is that during the Cold War Red Scare, when supposed subversives were being questioned both by congressional committees or the FBI or their own institutions, they were never asked about their teaching and research. It was always assumed, and it was true, that they didn't proselytize in class, that they didn't bias their research, because they would have been found out. It wouldn't have worked, let alone the fact that you can't teach a student anything if he or she doesn't want to learn.
Yeah, we did want to ask specifically about universities because this is obviously an area you've studied closely. Today, the U.S. federal government can threaten billions in research funding. We've seen foreign academics testify that they've stopped speaking publicly or attending conferences.
Yeah.
Candidly, my colleagues have even had experiences on this show with American academics that have talked privately about being less than willing to speak candidly on the record. You've actually described what's happening to American higher education today as, quote, worse than McCarthyism. Why is that?
Two main reasons. One, it's a much broader attack. McCarthyism really only was looking for communists. I mean, they, scared a lot of other people. It spread, but it was directed against communism, which really did exist. They destroyed it, but nonetheless, it was just against a group of people and their political affiliations. That was it. Today, it's looking at everything that could possibly be a way to punish higher education. It's not just forcing universities to fire people, but it's, as you pointed out, clamping down and withholding enormous amounts of money and putting a stop to a lot of basic science. I mean, what in the world is the Trump administration doing here? They are really destroying American science, as it were, eating our seed corn by not letting foreign students come into the country, things like that. It's just crazy. But the other thing is that universities are much less powerful. The 1950s and the 1960s were what has been called the golden age of higher education. And just as McCarthyism was shrinking the political spectrum on American campuses and leading to an enormous amount, mainly of self-censorship, not so much overt censorship, which is what we're seeing today. But self-censorship and a similar refusal to get involved in teach a controversial course. I interviewed somebody who was in French history, I think, and he said he just stopped teaching about the French Revolution. It was too controversial. That kind of thing, I think, is happening today, and it happened during the McCarthy period. People just pulled back from being political.
We've spent a lot of time talking about what happens during these periods, what we've called Red Scares, but we do want to ask about how they end. For you, what was actually required to end the last Red Scare? And do you take any lessons from that moment that might apply today?
What caused the end of McCarthyism is clearly a number of things, just as there were a number of reasons. Us historians are never going to give you one answer. Come on. We believe in nuance and complication. But anyhow, there were a number of reasons. One of the most important one was that the witch hunters ran out of witches, especially witches that would bring them headlines. Who's going to be really that interested in a suburban housewife who sent money to prisoners of war in France or something? It just wasn't the kind of thing that was going to get on the front pages, not like a Hollywood screenwriter or atomic spy. but so they ran out of witches. Everything contributed. Yes, Edward R. Murrow's television programs on McCarthy's craziest victims and how McCarthyism, hurt innocent people, which it did, helped.
We must remember always that accusation is not proof, and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason if we dig deep in our history and our doctrine, and remember that we are not descended from fearful men.
Certainly the Army McCarthy hearings, where the very clever Boston lawyer Joseph Welch turns to McCarthy as he's smearing one of Welch's law partners and says,
"Let us not assassinate this lad further, Senator. You've done enough. Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?"
And pulls the mask off McCarthy himself. But that was occurring in the spring of 1954. And something else was occurring as well in the spring of 1954. The Supreme Court was about to hand down its Brown versus Board of Education ruling that made segregation illegal in United States public schools. And that really changed American society. It ignited a already existing civil rights movement. And as the civil rights movement grew, it could no longer be ignored. And so what drove McCarthyism from the front pages were all those ordinary citizens who were marching, walking to work in Montgomery, Alabama during the Montgomery bus boycott, or the college students who sat down at a soda fountain in Greensboro, North Carolina. All of the things that began the civil rights movement and made McCarthyism and the quote-unquote threat of communism really irrelevant. So, it wasn't because of opposition to McCarthyism within civil society. And that seems to be beginning to happen now. We're seeing some university presidents saying no when Trump threatens to pull Harvard's research money for billions of dollars away, saying, no, we're not going to play your games. You can't take over whole departments and appoint outside monitors. Thank you very much. They are beginning to stand up to Trump's threats in a way that pretty nearly no academic institutions did during the McCarthy period. And so we have to really think about ordinary citizens fighting back, as they have done, say, against ICE in Minneapolis. So things are different. There is opposition. There are politicians who are willing to speak out. There aren't enough of them. And what's happened is that the system, the political system, Congress and the Supreme Court, are very much under the thumb of the Trumpian MAGA section of the Republican Party. And it may or may not be too late to salvage our democratic system. I mean, the threat is much greater than McCarthyism ever was. If American democracy can survive the MAGA onslaught, I think we'll be okay. But it's a very big but. And everybody has to realize that their lives are going to be very much affected if this MAGA movement continues.
Ellen Schreckman, we thank you for all of this nuance and context. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's all for today. I'm Aaron Wary. Thanks for listening.